A third response to the question of how can it be that as Europe is being emancipated and enlightenment and democracy sweeps across Europe and Napoleon is tearing the ghetto walls down, how are we still being left behind? And this answer is what we would now call, is a clumsy, I hate labels, but we just do it. It's just a way to compartmentalize society, I guess. This answer was put forward by what we would now call the ultra-Orthodox movement. So famously, I'll mention one figure. Rav Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the Baal HaTanya, the founder of the Chabad Lubavitch movement that, you're all familiar with, he famously davened. He prayed that Napoleon would lose in his invasion of Russia. Napoleon didn't officially lose, didn't surrender, but he retreated. He was defeated by the Russian winter, and he retreated, I think he lost 80% of his troops. He was completely stuck in his Russian campaign. The Tsar famously just burnt Moscow to the ground and abandoned it, and Napoleon had bet the house on conquering Moscow and forcing the Tsar to resign and to surrender, but it didn't happen. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe of Shneur Zalman of Liadi, his students were shocked. If you know your history, you'll know that whatever anti-Semitism our brethren were experiencing in places like France and Germany, if you think about French anti-Semitism, like the Alfred Dreyfus affair, the kangaroo court that led to another answer to this question, which we're going to explore, which was Theodor Herzl and Zionism. Zionism becomes a fifth answer to this same question, burning on the minds of European Jewry. But if you look at anti-Semitism in England, in France, Germany, Spain, compared to what was happening in Russia under the Tsars, under Nikolai II, it was nothing. The suffering of the Jews of Russia was appalling, unthinkably bad and painful. And so when Rav Shneur Zalman started to daven that Napoleon, the great emancipator and redeemer, the freer of the Jews, would lose and would have to retreat from Russia, his students said, what are you doing? Like, this is our ticket out of this mess. We've been living in hell for generations. This is our ticket out. And he said to them, you underestimate. Yes, it's hell. And yes, it's difficult. And yes, we face persecution. But assimilation, he said, is an even greater challenge. And it looks like the promise, of a land flowing with milk and honey. That's what Napoleon is offering us. But if you really see what's going on just across the border in Germany and in France, you'll see the threat of assimilation. And it has been called, I've heard it called, and I know, forgive me, it's clumsy language, but I've heard it called the gentle Holocaust. It's when Jews en masse just drift off and dilute into wider society. And Judaism ceases to exist because Jews cease to exist, but gently. Not like the Holocaust, but gently. And this is what Rav Shneur Zalman of Lubavitch was fearful of. And he said to his students, "Look, I'm with you, shoulder to shoulder. We're going to stand together and we're going to fight against what the Tsar is doing to us. But it's sometimes much more dangerous when a person doesn't even realize the danger that he's in." And that's what he saw assimilation as being. Effectively, the response of the ultra-Orthodox movement to the very same question of why is anti-Semitism going nowhere, even though we're officially emancipated, the ultra-Orthodox camp essentially turned around and said it's going nowhere because it never will go anywhere. And we'll explore this in another session of where this really comes from. But it came from a recognition that the Jewish people have a very unique, specific mission in this world, in this life. We are here to fulfill very specific task and a very specific purpose, and anti-Semitism will always exist because there's always going to be antagonism and hatred and even jealousy of the fact that we're here to fulfill that mission. It's inevitable. How bad it gets, that's not inevitable. That we can control. We can campaign against it, and through our own actions, we can control it. But it exists in principle. It's always going to be. It's always going to be the case. And therefore, the ultra-Orthodox said, this is the strongest sign you could ever need, that we need to batten down the hatches, we need to double down on our own commitment to Judaism, because wider society is never going to let us through that door. So again, Society opens the door. The Jews of Europe, emancipated Europe, see they're not allowed to walk through it. The reform and conservative movements say it's okay if you shed some baggage, drop some bags, drop some luggage, you'll fit through the door. So change yourself and you're going to fit through the door. The ultra-Orthodox camp said absolute nonsense. And in fact, they walked up to that door and slammed it shut. And thus began, and you'll recognize this again in, it's really helpful to understand modern Israeli politics and the clashes that take place between secular and ultra-Orthodox, but there is a deep-rooted distrust, bordering paranoia of any form of change. Any form of change is seen as a fatal threat by the ultra-Orthodox camp. They don't want to walk through that door. They want to close the door of society and preserve Judaism in its utmost form, because anti-Semitism ain't going anywhere anyway. Okay? Now, we can argue with the sentiment, we can argue with the theory. I'm just presenting the ethos and the approach. Now, there were various amazing things that came. I don't know, it is a little bit shocking to hear it, but bear in mind, the same Rav Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the Baal HaTanya, who prayed for Napoleon to be defeated to avoid assimilation amongst the suffering Jews of Russia, he's the same, I told you before. He founded Chabad Lubavitch, which all of you are nodding, all recognize as probably being the most out there, just being there for whenever the joke that was going around was that why did NASA send a mission, the Artemis 2 mission? Why did they send the billions of dollars to send a mission to the dark side of the moon? To see if there's a Chabad house there, right? That was why they sent the mission to the dark side of the moon. Maybe there's a Chabad house there. So it's the same movement that cares more than any other movement for every Jew, no matter where they are or what they're doing. You've got to reconcile those two things. The founder of that movement was the one davening, praying that Napoleon should lose and we should avoid assimilation. It's an incredible thing. So numerous positive things have come out of the ultra-Orthodox response, because they also understood that, we can't just slam the door and tell all of our suffering followers that we should continue suffering, because they're just not going to listen. Why would they listen to that? Why would they voluntarily accept suffering? So two major movements emerged out of positive movements, emerged out of this fear and paranoia of change. The first movement is Hasidus, which we've just mentioned. Lubavitch is one idea. The idea of a Hasidic community where community bonds are immensely strong and people are constantly looking out for one another. The number of chesed projects that go on in these communities, the altruism that goes on is just mind-boggling. Things like music and song and coming together for meals and dancing are all brought in by the Hasidic movement in order to strengthen the fact that we've shut the door of society, we're going to double down as a community. That's outcome number one. Outcome number two, which is more of the Lithuanian school of thought, is a recognition that, one of the dangers of assimilation is that it grew slowly but not particularly quickly, is that several universities and colleges have now started opening their doors to accept at least a quota of Jewish students, and that's really quite tempting. Imagine if you've been denied your whole life, and your fathers, and your grandfathers, and great-grandfathers, as far back as you can remember, your whole family have been denied the opportunity of getting a higher education and securing an amazing job. Just imagine that for a second. Now, that's really tempting. So what the Lithuanian section of the ultra-Orthodox response did was created what we now know as the yeshiva movement. So yeshiva is a Talmudic college, and they built world-renowned Talmudic Torah academies, which were just as elitist, if not more elitist, and just as academic, if not more academic, than even the best universities out there. I shared with you a number of months ago, famously, one of the most famous of these yeshivas, sadly, it wasn't open for very long before it was ransacked and closed by the Nazis, but was the yeshiva of Chachmei Lublin, the famous yeshiva of Rabbi Meir Shapiro in Lublin in Poland, where the entrance exam for that yeshiva to get in, forget like advancing through the classes, just to get in, yeah, we talk about elitism, was to memorize 400 pages of Talmud with all of the relevant commentaries. Now, to put that into perspective, when I went to yeshiva, my entrance exam was 2 pages of Talmud with the relevant commentaries that I had to memorize, right? So 400 pages. So again, the Russian, Belarusian and Ukrainian side of ultra-Orthodoxy creates the Hasidic movement in response to this problem, and the Lithuanian and parts of Polish side of it creates the yeshiva movement to bring the elitism, the academics, but in a very robustly Jewish way. Those are the responses so far. There's one more that we now need to discuss before we start getting into the clash between these various ideologies, and that one is, of course, modern, what we now call modern Orthodoxy. So again, if we understand the analogy that the Reform and Conservative movements look at the open door of society and want to walk all the way through, and ultra-Orthodoxy looks at the same open door and says, too dangerous, and slams it shut again. What modern Orthodoxy uniquely tries to do is have 1 foot, one side of the door, and 1 foot in, one out and one in, and tries to juggle and balance the best of both worlds. So again, what does modern Orthodoxy have in common with Reform and Conservative Judaism? We, and I now say we because the United Synagogue represents modern Orthodoxy in this country, we believe in change. We believe that certain things do indeed need to change. But because we have in common with the ultra-Orthodox movement, unlike Reform and Conservative, that we believe the Torah was given by Hashem to Moshe, to Moses, through a process not of divine inspiration, but actual prophecy, like I'm talking to you now. We believe, therefore, in the absolute authority of the Torah and the absolute authority of the sages who interpreted. They weren't just very special and very clever people. They were absolute experts in how to interpret the Torah. And just like if, God forbid, a person has a very worrying medical concern, you wouldn't go and see a consultant or a specialist you wouldn't want to. If you had a choice between a consultant or a specialist who's an intern or just graduated and qualified a week ago versus someone with 20 years of experience on the operating table, in their pocket, you'd go to the second guy, right? You'd want to see the greatest expert on a matter of life and death. And modern Orthodoxy says the same thing as ultra-Orthodoxy, which is we cannot budge beyond our belief that the Torah was given by Hashem and our sages were and remain the absolute experts in its interpretation. And because of this, change in the modern Orthodox world, again, in the ultra-Orthodox world, to a great extent, there's no such thing as change. It's like, how many Jews does it take to change a light bulb? Change? It's that joke, right? But in modern Orthodoxy, we are open to change, but there will be a line, and that line cannot be crossed. I'll give you an example of this. We have it right here. We use this the whole time. You go to an ultra-Orthodox shul, and you try to find a genuine one. You go to a place in Meir Sharim or in Stanford Hill, you try to find me a Siddur with English. Try to find me one. You won't find one. You might find one with Yiddish, but you won't find one with English. You go downstairs here, every Siddur you pick up has translation. Where do we get that from? Where did the idea of translation? The idea of translation came, I told you before, it came from the Reform movement. That's a change that's acceptable. That is an example of a change that doesn't cross any boundaries, doesn't cross any lines. There's no problem halachically in Jewish law whatsoever in 99% of the prayer service for a person to pray in English or in the language they understand. There's no problem whatsoever. But we don't want to discourage people or encourage people into laziness. So we'll keep one side the original Hebrew text, and the other side can be translated. If you want to read it in it. I always say to people, Hashem understands English. He has a subscription to these Duolingo. He understands English. It's fine. So that's the example of the modern Orthodox movement looking at what Reform did and going, actually, that's an idea we can incorporate, and it's a very helpful idea. Thank you very much. Another idea that we have, again, in the ultra-Orthodox world, you'd be thrown out. They'd laugh you out the building. But in Stanmore, once every quarter, every few months, we have the women's tefillah group. Right? Women come together and they have their own room, and it's led by women, and it's just for women. Although I've spoken in there quite a few times, but I don't go in there at the end and I speak. That is an example of pushing change to the very, very, very tip of the line. You cannot go further. In modern Orthodoxy, you will not then take the next step, which is for women to be leading the main service that incorporates men as well. That will not happen. The day that happens, you've crossed the boundary and you've moved away from Orthodoxy. But that's an example, again, of change that we've looked at and said, actually, we can push to this degree because we're open to living in both worlds. We recognize that the world is changing, it's a rapidly changing place. We recognize that that's been the case since the 17, 18, 1900s. It's a rapidly changing place. And for Judaism to remain vibrant and vital and full of life as it always has been, we're going to need 1 foot out the door and 1 foot in. So that is the modern Orthodox take on things, with, as you can see, the elements that we share, as it were, with the Reform and Conservative movements, and then the elements that we share, or the beliefs that we share with the ultra-Orthodox movement as well. Which means that someone who's genuinely modern Orthodox, if they were stuck on a train or an airplane, you've got the dreaded middle seat, and to your left is someone from a, Reform shul, and to your right is someone from a shtibel, an ultra-Orthodox shtibel. A genuinely modern Orthodox person should be able to have a conversation with both, and a really enjoyable one, because there actually is quite a lot in common in worldview and in religious beliefs. Okay, those are the major responses to this European-wide dilemma of what do we do about the Jews and what do we do with Judaism. Let's get to the critiques, and then from there finish off with how we might explain this to our children. So the Orthodox movement, modern Orthodox, however you want to say it, the problems that the Orthodox movement had with Reform, some we've mentioned, haven't gone anywhere to a great extent. And although the Reform movement has changed, and it was the Holocaust more than anything that changed this, because challenge number 1 that the Orthodox movement would have against the Reform movement is look at how much baggage you've dropped and they're still not letting you through the door. And maybe the ultra-Orthodox were right. Maybe they called it right. Maybe embracing change was a waste of time and energy for us all. And this really became an impossible to disprove argument with the onset of the final solution to the Jewish question, which is look at how much you have integrated. And it's the most painful thing that, you look at Germany pre-Adolf Hitler. You look at the Weimar Republic and you look at how many leading artists and poets and philosophers and financiers and politicians. It was turned against them, of course, because Hitler said, well, look at the Weimar Republic, look at how many of our politicians are Jewish. But you look at how deeply embedded secular Reform German Jews were. They were the fabric, they contributed so much to the fabric of society. And sadly, they all went on the same cattle cars. They all met the same fate as their Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox brothers and sisters. They all went to the same place. The degree to which they had dropped the luggage of Judaism was immaterial. It meant nothing. It was a problem in their blood, is the way it was explained, a genetic problem that they could never solve. And so the Reform movement since the Holocaust has acknowledged that it dropped too much baggage. It stripped away too much Judaism, and the Holocaust proved that doing that was a total waste of time and energy. And that's challenge number 1 that Orthodoxy has against making changes so sweepingly, is to what benefit, to what purpose, what do we actually gain by doing so? Challenge number 2 we've mentioned is that the Reform movement, to a great extent, was based on apologetics, or what we would call victim blaming, as I mentioned before. It's placing society's problem on the shoulders of the Jews. It's saying the reason why society persecutes Jews is because we're too Jewish. What sort of a philosophy or a sociological outlook is that? That sounds like you're blaming the victim. It's exactly the discourse, as I said, that we've heard recently. The reason random innocent Jews are being randomly attacked in the streets of London is because if only this wasn't happening in Israel, there's no connection between the two. Only in the imagination of the anti-Semite does that connection exist, and Orthodoxy called out and continues to call out the Reform movement for making that clumsy step into victim blaming. Another one, if the main purpose of the Jewish people is to live as ethical people, but we've, again, stripped away the idea that we have a book of ethics. We don't actually have a guidebook that was given to us by God, because the Torah was created by people, imperfect people, who just like us are also just trying to be ethical people in society. Orthodoxy asks the Reform movement a political question, which is, well, if you put the cart before the horse, and you say that there's actually nothing leading Judaism that's overtly Jewish, that we're being led by wider society, who sets the agenda? Who decides what's right and what's wrong? Who decides what's ethical and unethical? You go back not that long ago to the 2nd and 3rd century, there were still major societies and empires around the world who believed that child sacrifice was the highest expression of devotion and loyalty to a god. It saw that as ethical. It saw it as virtuous. You can go back even more recently. Go back to Nazi Germany, I've mentioned it before, where tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people saw the eradication of Jews as virtuous. So Orthodoxy turns to the Reform movement and says, once you've removed God and objective objective standards from the equation, who sets the agenda? And how on earth can we trust a wider society that in history has shown itself to be incapable, time and again, of making the right ethical decision? Again, a very strong question. It also leads into a second political question, which is, how do you avoid Judaism becoming just a mouthpiece of a political movement? Nowhere is this felt more strongly than the United States, where essentially, if you are a Reform Jew, I'd bet my house that you vote Democrat, and I'd bet my house that you agree with all the Democrat Party's ideology, all of them, every policy the Democrat Party puts forward in its manifesto. I would put my house that you agree with all of them. So what prevents, again, if you put the cart before the horse, what prevents Judaism just becoming a mouthpiece or a wing of a political movement? We argue that Judaism is supposed to transcend politics. There are numerous other questions, but I think we'll finish this section with probably the strongest one, and we're going to pick up on this, please God, next week in the next installment in this series. This is a question in theology, okay? And this challenge from the Orthodox camp goes as follows. You need to think it through a little bit. Just let it settle, let it sink in. It turns to the Reform movement and says, okay, like us in Orthodoxy, you believe in God, which they do, they always have done. You believe in the creator of all existence. But you also say that the creator of all existence created all of this and put all of us here by intelligent design, but didn't once communicate to us our purpose or our objective, didn't once communicate to us how to be better people in the world that he has given us. That sounds a bit strange. Okay? Let it settle, let it percolate, distill. It is a phenomenally strong question, because Reform and conservative Judaism is based on the claim that there is a God who created all of existence and then never told that existence what the purpose of existence is. Didn't bother. Never once. Again, they claim the Torah was not given, nothing was given by God. We were just created and put here and kind of left to guess. We were left to work it out for ourselves. And Orthodoxy looks at this and says that sounds not just absurd, but deeply counterintuitive. Many times our sages encourage us to understand our relationship with Hashem in the same way that we relate to our children, which is very appropriate considering the nature of the series that we're going through. And this, to give an analogy, would be like a parent who makes sure that their child has food and shelter, and there will sometimes be challenges, and it'll be tough sometimes for the child. They'll have a roof over their head, they'll have clothes, they'll have heating. The parent makes sure the child has everything they need to survive, but the parent doesn't ever speak to the child and communicate values or education or an upbringing, never puts anything into that child in terms of guiding and directing and molding that child into being the best person he or she could be. That is essentially how Reform and Conservative are demanding that we view God. That God gives us this world, and yes, there are sometimes serious challenges, of course. It gives us food and shelter and warmth and clothing and a place to live and sleep and whatever you have, but never once bothers to communicate any sort of mission or purpose or any sort of guidance to us whatsoever. Now, whether or not you believe every word in the Torah is true and given by God, we'll discuss that next week, but just in principle, let that question settle in. As in my opinion, that is the strongest question the Orthodox movement has always asked against the Reform and Conservative movement, because it reduces God to not an abusive parent, but negligent, deeply negligent. And such an idea seems so absurd and so counterintuitive that we might wonder how it became so widespread. Okay, those are the major questions. Now, how do we go about presenting this? As I said at the very, very beginning, it's a matter of when in this day and age. Because even if they never encounter, our children never encounter these ideas at home, chances are they'll stumble upon them online somewhere. Something will come up on YouTube or Instagram, whatever it is. It's especially true nowadays. I have so many youngsters who come up to me that they've seen this video on TikTok of someone making this claim from the Islamic perspective against Judaism or the Christian perspective against Judaism, and like, what do I say? I don't know what to do. It sounds really convincing. I don't. It's a matter of when. It's not a matter of if anymore. That's been the shift in the last 20 years or so. So how do we approach this with our children? So rule number one, it's an open forum. It's an open forum. We are just as, if not more, interested to hear their perspective as we'd like them to be to hear our perspective. That's rule number one. Rule number two, which I think is even more important, is we have to first go through all of these sorts of questions ourselves. Like, where do I stand on that question? Where do I stand on the question of, do I trust wider society, and can I rely on wider society to set an ethical agenda for the rest of us? Do I trust that process? Do I trust that Judaism, once you've stripped away belief in God's giving the Torah, do I trust that it won't morph into just a political movement? Do I think that education is enough? Do we know enough? All these sorts of, and again, the number one question, as I said, the knockout question, which is, what do I think? Like, do I believe in God? And if I do believe in God, do I think it's likely that God has never once communicated any sort of directional guidance to his creations? Where do I sit on all of these questions? We have to know where we sit. And I'll say something, I'll keep bringing this up in many more weeks to come. It's what I call the tooth fairy paradox. Tooth fairy paradox. One of our youngest, Micha, he just lost his second tooth. He's only 5. He's just lost his second tooth. And for some reason, the tooth fairy gave him £1. I think it's very generous. It's obviously taken inflation into account. I only got 20p. He got £1 for this tooth. Okay, he was all excited about the tooth fairy. The question is, and this is, been studies about this in educational psychology, when do children stop believing in the tooth fairy? Yeah? No, everyone thought about it. When do children stop believing in the tooth fairy? And what was discovered was remarkable and so useful, this analogy, to understand how we need to approach these questions as parents. Children stop believing in the tooth fairy when one day they've lost a tooth, and when they're asleep we slip 50p or £1 or nowadays 10 quid, whatever it is, or PS5, we slip a PS5 under their pillow, whatever it is we do, slip £1 under their pillow, and then they wake up in the morning and they come downstairs, oh, Mum, Dad, I got £1 in my tooth, yeah, I got a little bag with a tooth and £1, I got £1, they're so excited, right? They're so excited, they got £1 for their tooth, a fantastic exchange rate, they didn't even have to do anything for it, it just fell out, they get a £1 coin, and they're very excited by that. And then we go to them, oh wow, it must have been the tooth fairy visited you when you were sleeping and gave you a £1 coin for your tooth. And what's been discovered is that as children get older and develop cognitively, they start sensing the lie in the story that we're telling them. They start hearing that when I go as their parent, oh, it must have been the tooth fairy, they can hear the nonsense in the words that I'm saying. They can hear the fact that I don't really believe the words coming out of my mouth, and they themselves start doubting the conviction they had that there's such a thing as a tooth fairy. That is such an important principle, because it means that in all of these conversations with our children, and in approaching any of these questions, if we don't believe the answers that we're saying, they will detect that. And again, as I've said before, they will simply look elsewhere for someone who sounds like they're speaking with more conviction. And we live in a day and age, and you all know this, the influencer era, right? We live in a day and age where it's so easy online to fake conviction. And to fake being fully believing and fully behind an idea. It's so easy for them to find that elsewhere, away from the safety of ourselves and their own home. So keep in mind the tooth fairy paradox and go through these questions one by one. And then once we've settled on where we stand on these, invite your children into the discussion. I'll give you a few examples. Do we feel that history has shown assimilation to be a successful solution to anti-Semitism? Do we think assimilation is a good thing? It's not an easy, it's a simple question to understand, but not an easy one to answer. Do we think that dropping baggage and getting rid of bags and then walking through the door, do we think that's a good thing on the balance of it? If it is a good thing, are we comfortable with the fact that it sounds a bit like victim blaming? And if it's not a successful option, if we don't think it's a good idea, why do we not think assimilation is good? Why would we say that assimilation is a bad thing? Do we think as parents that Jews maybe have a special calling or a special mission that we're meant to fulfill in this world? And if we do, what might that be? And then when we sit down with our children, reverse engineer that, reflect it onto them, invite them into the conversation and say, you've experienced this, you've come home from school, you've been shouted at, you've been shoved, at the train station, people have called you names, you've had, drink poured all over you, people have chanted at you and shouted at you. What do you think? You've experienced it. What do you think the solution to anti-Semitism is? Do you think the solution is the gentle Holocaust of assimilation, of just, we'll solve anti-Semitism by getting rid of Semitism? Open that conversation. Don't be afraid of it. Open that conversation. We've so many stories of children who, coming home from school now and going around university, have taken off their Magen David, taken off their kippah, not looking overtly or outwardly Jewish at all. Sit down with them. And it's a great conversation to have and say to them, in an ideal world where you didn't face the threat, the shadow of anti-Semitism, would you still wear your kippah and your Magen David walking around campus? And if they answer yes, that's an indicator that they don't think assimilation is the real answer. It may be a practical answer. It may be just stripping away my Judaism works and it helps me to avoid being in a case of, in danger, in a threatening scenario. But they don't really believe that's the solution. So explore that with them. Explore with them, we make significant demands from you of maybe where you can eat and who you can visit and who you can date and who you can marry and how much laning you have to learn for your bar mitzvah and when you have to fast and when you don't have to fast. Like, we make quite a few demands of you. What do you think? What do you think the role of the Jewish people is? It's worth exploring with them. We want to be ethical people. We want you as our child to be an ethical person as well, but can we trust society to set that agenda? What do you think about that? I think another one that we need to settle on and we need to sort of make our peace with is the God question. As I said before, do we believe in God? If we do we believe it's more or less likely that he would have at some point communicated some sort of mission statement or some sort of purpose to us to help us guide ourselves through life? Ask the same questions to your children. Do you believe in God? Why are we here? If they say yes, why did he create all of existence? Why are we here? What are the mitzvot? What do they mean to you? A key difference, a crucial difference that we didn't explore earlier between Reform and Conservative and then Orthodox on the other side is that in the Reform and Conservative movement, the main function and purpose of a Jewish person is to be an ethical person. To be an ethical person. In the Orthodox camp, which includes modern Orthodoxy, the main function and purpose of a person is to be godly. Yeah, and that's only possible. It's only possible to be godly if God has told us how to do it. Otherwise, who knows if I'm just emulating my own ego, or who knows if I'm emulating society, or I'm emulating celebrities, or I'm just emulating my parents. Who knows if what I'm emulating is godly unless God has communicated it. So explore these with our children. And if we settle on an idea, a question that I often have, that often comes to me, is, well, this is a bit uncomfortable then, because as a family, we've discussed it, we do believe in God, and we do believe that in all likelihood he communicated some sort of purpose and mission to humanity at some point, but we don't keep all the mitzvot. Far from it. There's many, many hundreds we don't keep. I always say in that case, because our kids will smell the contradictions and the hypocrisies quicker than we'll ever be able to. I'll give you an example where this comes up a lot. A family, again, that makes demands of their children. That says after school you cannot go to McDonald's. And after school when you come home, do not bring non-kosher home into my house. We keep a kosher kitchen, right? This is very, very, very common in the United Synagogue. We keep a strictly kosher kitchen. You know, don't you dare. You're not going to McDonald's with your friends. You dare bring anything back into my kitchen that's not kosher. But then when we go on holiday, well, I don't want kosher to ruin a good holiday. There's plenty of stunning places in the world where there aren't any Chabad houses and you can't get hold of kosher food. Well, I don't want that to get in the way of a holiday. So we'll go on holiday and you're not going to eat seafood. A lot of people won't eat seafood or pork or pig-based food, but they'll eat out. They'll sort of eat vegetarian and eat fish, and actually a lot of that stuff is not kosher and certainly isn't supervised, and our children pick up on that. And they may say, well, one second, you said you believe in God. You said you believe that to some extent the Torah was given by God, but we keep kosher at home, but then when we go on holiday, we don't keep kosher. Expliquez-moi. Yeah? Our children could say that to us. Be honest. Just be honest. Best approach is always honesty and say, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. You've spotted a contradiction and you're not wrong to have spotted it. But what we want you to know is, yes, we have those belief systems, but it's not all or nothing. It's not all or nothing. There are us, and our sages teach this. There are 613 mitzvot to allow us the opportunity, because out of all those hundreds of mitzvot, chances are everyone's going to find something they really connect to. And through that connection point, the word mitzvah literally means a connection point. Through that connection point, that's how we're going to connect to God. But right now, we're not ready to take on the commitment of fully keeping kosher, which means not only keeping kosher at home, but only going to destinations when we go on holiday where kosher food is readily available, which does knock out 70% of planet Earth. That's just the reality of it, right? Or we just go and we pack loads of pot noodles and we just eat that 3 meals a day, whatever it is. So be honest. Be honest, you're right, but as a family, we're not yet, it's always yet, maybe one day we will, but we're not yet ready to fully keep this on. But that does not undermine the fact that we have a firm belief system, that we truly value this, we genuinely see God in this world, and we genuinely believe that this comes from God. But right now, where we are as a family, we're not yet ready to take it on to 100%. And Orthodoxy, or certainly modern Orthodoxy, the beauty of modern Orthodoxy, unlike ultra-Orthodoxy, is that modern Orthodoxy created the space and the elasticity, the flexibility for that to be possible, as long as we insert the word yet after we say, you're right, I don't keep kosher on holiday yet. That's how to phrase it. And there are many more discussion points that can be had, but again, first and foremost is to go through and not always, but from time to time, contemplate the tooth fairy paradox and just introspect for a moment and think, how convinced am I about my own beliefs? Because ultimately, we as a parent, I am insisting on quite a few sacrifices for my children, certainly my teenagers and my uni student children, to make. I'm making quite a number of demands, and I'm making those demands in Hashem's name and in the Torah's name. And ideally, I don't want to make those demands and frame them in such a way that it sounds like we're doing this because this is what we've always done, or it's going to make grandpa and grandma very upset, or it's because the community expects it. No, we're making those demands and we'd like our children to enthusiastically embrace them, but then all their friends are doing different things. Yeah? And then everyone that they are coming into contact with on social media, who are largely not Jewish as well, are doing different things. So in making these demands and sacrifices or requesting these sacrifices from our children, these life choices from our children, it is crucial that we submit ourselves first to the tooth fairy challenge, which is, how convinced am I about the position that I'm taking and insisting my children follow? That is so important. And once we've reached that point, we may start spotting that there are actually areas of contradictions and hypocrisy in where I stand as a parent. At that point, just be honest. Call out the elephant in the room and say, yeah, you're right. We should really only keep kosher when we go on holiday as well. You're right, 100% right, but we're not yet ready to take that on. Just be honest. And that doesn't undermine or pull the rug out from the whole belief system that claims to support it. And then finally, as I said, it's important, once we've gone through that thought process and we've contemplated each of those questions for each of the topics that we're going to be discussing in this series, is to then create a space where we are reflecting onto our children, not projecting is very unhealthy, but reflecting onto our children. This is the way I see it. How do you see it? How do you see? It's going to be a very different perspective. Most of us probably don't suffer anti-Semitic abuse on social media. Most of our children do. It's a very different lived experience. So how do you experience anti-Semitism? What do you think the solution to anti-Semitism should be? Do you think assimilation is a good thing or a bad thing? And in an ideal world where we need to feel the pressures to assimilate or not, what do you think to open up that open dialogue with our children? And I think that can only lead to a much, much healthier and stronger relationship in our shared Jewish experience. Thank you so much for joining. Have a great week.